Picture this. Your trees are still green in the middle of summer. You barely touch the hose. Meanwhile, all around you, lawns are turning brown, sprinklers are firing every morning, and water bills just keep creeping up. Now imagine the thing making that possible costs less than lunch. Not a tank, not a pump, not a smart irrigation system, not some expensive drought gadget, just a small earthwork, a pit, a contour in the soil, a simple shape in the ground. And in some places, the second you use that shape to keep too much rain on your own land, you stop looking like a homeowner and start looking like a legal issue.
Because this is the part nobody says clearly enough.
Real drought proofing is not about storing water in containers. It is about turning the earth itself into a giant living sponge. And once that clicks, the whole story changes. Because the most valuable reservoir on your property may be the one nobody ever taught you to notice. Most people hear the word drought and think one thing: not enough water. But for most of history, people understood something deeper. The problem was not always that the rain never came. The problem was that when it did come, the land could not hold on to it. That is the difference between the old way of thinking and the modern one. The modern system says capture water, pipe water, meter water, move water. The older system says slow it down, spread it out, sink it in. One treats water like a product. The other treats water like part of the land. And that is why this small Chinese swale system matters so much. Whether you call it a fish scale pit, a micro-catchment, or a tiny swale, the principle is the same. Shape the ground so rain pauses long enough to soak in instead of running away. It's not about making a puddle you can see. It's about building a moisture reserve underground, right where roots can actually use it. This is not storage above ground. This is storage below the surface, below your attention, below the whole way most people have been trained to think. And the second water starts staying in the land instead of flowing into drains, ditches, canals, and utility systems, people start paying attention. Here's the strange part. Rain falls on your roof. Rain falls on your yard. Rain falls on your property. Most people would assume that if you want to keep some of that moisture in your own soil, that's just common sense. In parts of the American West, it has never been that simple. A lot of these states built their water laws around old downstream rights. The basic idea was that water moving across a landscape was already spoken for by somebody farther down the system. That's why rainwater harvesting used to be heavily restricted in places like Colorado, and even now, residential collection is still limited for most households. Utah allows it too, but still regulates how much you can store and when registration is required. Now, think about what that means. If a simple earthwork slows runoff, spreads it, and pushes more water into the soil, you're not stealing water in the way most people use that word, but you are changing where that water ends up. And that's exactly where the tension begins, because a lot of the time, the law cares less about where rain lands and more about where that water is expected to go. That's why systems like this get complicated so fast. Sometimes the issue is water rights, sometimes it's stormwater regulation, sometimes it's grading permits, easements, setback rules, HOA restrictions, or utility concerns. But the pattern is always the same. The better your land gets at keeping its own water, the more likely somebody wants to regulate it. And that should lead straight to the next question. How can something as small as a $12 pit matter enough to make anyone nervous? Because this is where most people underestimate it. They hear swale or pit and they picture a muddy ditch, something rough, something primitive, something obviously less effective than a real irrigation system. But that's not where the power is. The power is not in what you see on the surface while it rains. The power is in what happens underground after the ground looks dry again. Modern drainage is built around one basic goal: get water off the land as quickly as possible. Curbs, gutters, storm drains, culverts, pipes. In that system, success means the surface dries out fast. But if your goal is surviving drought, that logic is almost backwards. Because drought-proofing is not about getting rid of water fast, it is about giving water time. Time to slow down, time to spread out, time to sink in. That is what an infiltration swale does. That is what a fish scale pit does. That is what a micro-catchment does. It interrupts runoff, slows it down, and gives it a chance to enter the soil instead of rushing away. Now picture a shallow 12-inch depression on a slope. Rain falls, water starts moving downhill, but instead of sheeting straight off the land, some of it gets caught in that basin. It pauses there. That pause is everything. Because infiltration is a time game, the longer water stays put, the more of it moves downward and outward into the soil. And once that happens, you are no longer dealing with surface moisture, you are creating a hidden reserve underground. A sprinkler wets the top layer, a pit charges the soil profile. That is why a tree planted into a properly mulched catchment can survive on far less supplemental watering than most people would believe. The water is not gone. It is protected from the sun, stored below the surface, and released slowly through the soil as the plant needs it. Pipes move water away. Sponges keep water alive. And if that still sounds too simple to matter, there is one place where this exact idea was used at such a massive scale that it changed an entire region. Because the real proof of this system didn't happen in somebody's backyard. It happened on a landscape so damaged, so eroded, and so written off that most modern planners would assume it needed a giant industrial fix. Instead, a huge part of the answer came from reshaping the land with simple tools, basic geometry, and patience. The Loess Plateau in northwestern China was once known as one of the most eroded places on Earth. Centuries of overuse, stripped vegetation, and relentless runoff had left huge areas barren, unstable, and deeply poor. Tens of millions of people were living across that region. And yet one of the largest restoration efforts in modern history didn't begin with the idea that the solution was to import endless water from somewhere else. It began with a much older idea: hold the rain where it falls. Across the Loess Plateau, restoration efforts used terraces, check dams, slope protection, revegetation, and fish scale pits cut into hillsides. Trees and fruit crops were planted into these simple catchments so runoff could be intercepted, slowed down, and pushed into the soil right where the plants needed it most. Think about how important that is. Fish scale pits were not some decorative little detail. They were a hydrology tool, a cheap, repeatable way to catch water on slopes, build soil moisture, help plants establish, and break the cycle of erosion. And the results were real. Vegetation came back, sediment runoff dropped, productivity improved, entire watersheds started behaving differently because the land was finally allowed to absorb water instead of constantly shedding it. The land didn't need more extraction, it needed more absorption. That's the part that stays with me. Billion-dollar systems are built to move water over distance. These tiny pits were built to make that distance less necessary. And once you see that, the suburban version of this story no longer feels small. It starts to feel quietly disruptive. This is usually the point where people mentally disconnect. They think, okay, maybe that worked on a hillside in China. What does that have to do with a backyard in Arizona, Nevada, Texas, or Southern California? The answer is everything. Because the laws of water don't stop working just because the property line got smaller. A suburban version of this does not have to look extreme.
Actually, the best version usually does not.
A micro-swale can look like a normal planting bed. A fish scale pit can look like a tree basin. A shallow contour depression can disappear under mulch and shrubs. A rock-lined rain garden can just look like landscaping. The principle is still exactly the same. Catch runoff, slow it down, and let it soak in close to where the plants can use it. Now, of course, this is where you have to be smart. Local rules matter, utility lines matter, easements matter, drainage patterns matter. In some places, you absolutely have to be careful about grading and setbacks, but none of that changes the bigger point. Modern neighborhoods were designed to shed water. You can redesign your own little piece of one to keep more of it. Not by flooding anything, not by building some giant trench, not by starting a war with your HOA, just by making your soil better at receiving rain. You do not need permission to understand gravity. And once you realize how little reshaping it can take to change how a yard hydrates, the financial side of this gets almost ridiculous.
Because at that point, this stops sounding like landscaping advice and starts sounding like something people should have told you years ago.
The only problem is, nobody makes much money if your solution is mostly a shovel and a little observation. Look at the math. A professional sprinkler system can cost thousands before you even pay for the water that runs through it. And then the ongoing costs begin. Leaks, broken heads, timer problems, repairs, seasonal adjustments, higher water rates, drought restrictions that can suddenly make the whole setup less useful right when you need it. Now compare that to a shovel, some mulch, a bit of planning, and a few well-placed basins. The exact number is not really the point. Maybe it is $12. Maybe it's just the cost of tools you already own. The point is that one model depends on constant paid input, and the other tries to make every rainfall do more before you ever turn on a hose. And that is what makes this such an uncomfortable little system. The cheaper the fix, the harder it is to sell. And once your trees start living off stored soil moisture instead of emergency watering schedules, you are not just saving money. You are stepping out of a system of constant dependence. You are becoming harder to bill, harder to ration, harder to pressure every dry season. So, if you came into this thinking drought proofing was mostly about tanks, timers, and expensive irrigation hardware, now you know the deeper truth. The real reservoir was never the plastic barrel. It was never the pipe. It was never the account attached to the bill. It was the ground itself. And that is why something as small as a pit on a hillside can matter so much. Because the moment land starts holding its own water, dependence starts to loosen. That's the real story here. Not just how to save a tree, how to make a landscape less dependent, less wasteful, and a little more self-sufficient. And maybe that's exactly why the oldest answers can feel so invisible in a world built to sell newer, more expensive problems.